Well, hello and good morning. Welcome to another talk by me. Today I'm going to be talking about the psychoanalytic frame and the transference and how that captures the transference. I'm going to be talking about an archetype of the mirror, which shows reflection, and I'm going to be talking about my encounter um, with forensic psychology that I anticipate will be emerging over time. But to frame just the discussion that I'm having right now, I'm on YouTube, and this is going to Facebook, and then will be stored up on my YouTube channel. And I'm using YouTube differently than other people do. I'm an internet psychologist. You can look back at my background. My dissertation was on internet psychology, the emerging field. And at the time, 20 years ago, 1990s or 30 years ago now, as the internet was coming forward into psychology, I looked at what that could do. How could psychology use the internet, or how is it going to use the internet going forward? And so I was involved in that, and had some presentations to the American Academy of Sciences, and the World Health Organization flew me over to Munich. That was a nice talk. Um, but the problem back then was the internet was new. It hadn't developed yet. We only had text-based communication. And what we needed was this interactive video kind of thing, YouTube. And off my office, like a Doxy Me, where you can just hop into my office and we're talking um, video mediated communication. So that wasn't available back in the 90s and early 2000s. So I went back to my standard practice, wound up in working with children in foster care and that sort of thing. But now the internet has flourished or bloomed into its more established potential here with YouTube and video communication. So I'm coming back. I'm an internet psychologist. I've been back for a while working internet to work with the family court pathology, and now I'm shifting media a little bit. I've worked on my blog and worked on Facebook posts, and now I'm moving into YouTube. One of the things to recognize about my background, if you look at my internet psychology background, if you look at that initial article, Childress and Osman, that sort of defines, it looks at ethical issues in online interventions. Okay, so my focus is actually using the internet to do interventions with people, and what avenues are available. And we can't think Flatlander. It's not the same as just translating face to face over. There's other things we can do with this medium. It's different. And so I'm doing that. I'm doing online interventions. And it's interesting. I'll write that up for an internet journal sometime, well, what exactly I'm doing. But right now, with this particular video, is I'm back writing a book, basically. That the YouTube, when I film something up for YouTube, it goes up there and I get a transcript of it. And then I've got an intern person I'm hired up I want to go to those transcripts, pull them down, and those then become the initial draft for a book or an article or something going back that direction. And so most people at this point, coming from Gutenberg and the Bible and the whole, things from the history of writing is in printing presses, is they think about doing a print book. And then more recently, you can do the print book to audiobook. Okay. And I'm just doing the reverse. I'm starting with the audio visual book and then generating the print book that way. I'm sort of dictating things in. And so this is what I'm using this for. I'm thinking this is going to be used as some part of additional writing at some point. And so I'm kind of dictating it into cyberspace. Now, I could just dictate this into a private channel, or I could, just send it to YouTube and not run it through Facebook. But I decided to just run it through Facebook for everybody, so everybody can see what I'm kind of thinking, or see what's coming, or see the writing process. So with that, though, what I really want to focus today, what I want to get down on in the transcript, is the concept of the frame and the mirror, and the what I anticipate that's going to develop into an encounter with the forensic psychologist. So let me start by talking about the therapeutic frame. Sometimes it's called the therapeutic frame. It's originally the psychoanalytic frame. It comes off Freud and just the very first start of psychoanalysis. And now um, I was not an initial psychoanalytic fan when I was in my master's program. I'm a more science-based guy, and so I was into cognitive behavioral stuff in my formation. But then I had a wonderful psychoanalytic mentor at Pepperdine, Dr. Shafransky, and had supervision group with him. I had courses with him, and he enlightened me a lot as to the psychoanalytic thinking. And then once I understood, it's really excellent for what it does. There's I think there's more efficient ways to work and better ways to work, but I really enjoy the depth psychology. And I'm pretty background in Jungian psychology. Read everything about Jung and was thinking about being a Jungian analyst, but you don't need to be a Jungian analyst if you're working with kids 0 to 5. So I like the psychoanalytic background. And one of the fundamental core issues of psychoanalysis is the frame and the capturing of the transference. So what Freud found when he initially started to encounter people and psyche and the unconscious is that people will transfer their patterns from their childhood trauma experiences. They'll transfer those onto the analyst. Okay. So, and believe that the analyst is their mother or their father or their, the bad person who did bad things or whatever it is that the pattern is, they will believe the analyst is doing that, and the world and other people and things. So what we want to do as an analyst is to capture that cleanly so we can interpret it back to the person and help them understand it's not me, it's actually you. But that's a hard thing to do because they're so convinced it's the analyst. No, it's you, it's you, it's you. And no. And so what the analyst does is becomes a blank screen, to capture that transference. So you just want to go absolutely blank, nothing. So that the only thing coming up is that. So you do what's called a psychoanalytic frame. You start at the same time, you end at the same time, you always say the same thing, you start the same way. What would you like to talk about today? Okay, that's a typical thing. How can I be helpful? That's a little frame. That's shifting. You're anticipating you are going to be helpful. So it's just little things like that. You don't say, "How can I be helpful?" It's, "What would you like to talk about today? What would you like to?" And when the time comes, you just stop it at the time. And when they say something, you're making interpretations or you're doing stuff. You want to stay very blank, very nothing. Okay, even you sit behind your patient, so they're laying on a couch and they're saying stuff into the air, and they're not even getting visuals off of you. And so everything, and that's the frame. And that's going to capture the structure and the appointment schedules and how do you reschedule and all the rules that govern the treatment is going to capture then the transference because you're so blank. Now, psychoanalysis has evolved since then. It's gone through object relations, and then it went through now a self-psychology, and we're into intersubjectivity, that we cannot ever be a blank screen. We're always giving some information out into the world. And so what the analysts have since adapted to is we, and I'll include myself in this, we control or create, are mindful of, let's put it that way, we are mindful of the information we're sending out. And then when we get information back, we filter out what we triggered. Okay, so it's like the messages out into the universe of physicists do. You can send something out, and when it comes back, you can filter out what you sent out and get only what's coming back. Okay, so that's kind of where analysis is now, self-psychology and intersubjectivity. But the idea of the frame and setting the frame to capture the transference is still a valid kind of concept, and that's what we want to do. Well, in the family courts, we're dealing with exactly the transference. Okay, that's what it is. It's the transfer of childhood trauma from the pathological parent to the current children, and situation. So it's not the transfer to the analyst, it's the transfer to the other spouse and parent. So it's more direct into the world. And the analyst, psychologist, human, can come in as a third party to that transference rather than eliciting it directly in the treatment session. So there's a quote from Perlman and Cortese about the transference and in the relationship, and how that the various roles, the abusive parent, victimized child, protective parent, and bystander. And that's talking about it in the analytic relationship. But we actually, in the family courts and situation, we got it raw in the world going forward. So the analysts would love to be over here. And that's why I include Kohut on my points. Mnuchin, Hale, Mnuchin, Bowlby, Mnuchin, Beck, Vander Kolk, Tronick, Kohut. Okay, I include Kohut in that string because the analysts would love to be over here because we got such clean, perfect transference in the world rather than in the treatment relationship. So because of that, I'm a psychologist, 2008, 2010. I look at the situation, and we have the transference of trauma all over the place. And so we have, and so I'm going to, I kind of looked at where we're headed. I looked at the situation, come up with a plan to solve things and do things. And one of the fundamental features of that plan is to present a frame to capture the transference. Okay, people hear me talk about the pathogen. Okay, the pathogen and the transference is going to be very much similar concepts. And so to expose the pathogen hides extraordinarily well. This is a sex abuse pathogen rippling, and that's what it does. It hides. And so I know that. I know the source code for it. I know how it's hiding. So I'm going to pull it out of its hiding. But if you go directly for it, you're going to wind up with all sorts of defenses and resistances and things. So, just like you would with an alley sand with your patient, if you start to interpret their transference, they're just going to run into all sorts of resistance. So what you do is you don't interpret it, you back off, you let them transfer it onto the relationship or onto the frame that you set up, and then you interpret it off the frame back to them. So that's the psychoanalytic frame, and that's how it captures the transference, and that's what I've done. Okay, I've set up a psychoanalytic frame to capture the transference in the family courts, and the transference is going to be that I'm capturing, that I'm targeting, is from the forensic psychologist. So it's the psychologist's participation in the shared delusional disorder, in the pathology, in there because of their own countertransference stuff. So the countertransference, the issues, the trauma issues in the psychologist is being captured by the trauma narrative of the pathology. victimized child, protective parent, abusive parent. That little triangle narrative and it's a false narrative in this situation. Okay, it used to be a true narrative: victimized child, protective parent, abusive parent. But now it's a ripple of that. It's a false narrative, but it's capturing the countertransference of the psychologist. Their own trauma is getting in there, and where it's capturing them is on the role of the protective other. Okay, so they are getting captured into the role of the protective other in this trauma narrative, and they're working through their own trauma stuff in this role of the protective other. And they don't realize it because they're part of the pathology, they're part of the delusional disorder, neurotic issues. Now, the question for an analytic world is we get that frame and we capture the transference. That's called creating a neurotic transference in that situation. We're going to create a little bit of a delusional disorder where they think I'm their mother or I'm their father or I'm their, abusive person or their lover or whoever. That's their psychosis. They're responding to their own past history rather than to actual reality of me. And so that's the neurotic transference. Now, we don't do analysis with narcissistic or borderline personalities because they will collapse into a psychotic transference. We'll actually pull out, if we do this whole frame thing and capturing the transference in analyzing a narcissist or borderline, we'll get a psychotic kind of break thing. We'll get the actual delusional disorder, and it's not a good idea to produce psychotic delusions in your patients. So typically, analysts won't do analysis with narcissist borderlines, but people like Kernberg and others, Masterson, have, and so because they're really good at what they do, so they've gotten valuable information from depth psychology regarding the self structures of damaged personalities, trauma damaged personalities. But in this situation, okay, we've got the psychosis. We got the diagnosis is a shared delusional disorder and factitious attachment pathology imposed on another. So we got a psychotic level transference from the allied parent, narcissistic borderline dark allied parent, and the transference is moving over to the targeted parent as being the bad ex-mommy or the bad husband, bad man kind of thing. And it's just their past trauma is influencing their current perceptions. And they're seeing dangers and abuse where none exist. And they need to protect the child because it's their own self as a child being abused by their parent. And so it's all this depth psychology stuff on the transgenerational transmission of trauma. That's the pathology, the transgenerational transmission of trauma. It's the transference. There it is. Boop. And so given that situation, and I'm a psychologist, I'm looking at that situation, I set up a therapeutic frame to capture the transference of the mental health people. Because we need real psychologists over here fixing the pathology, not these psychologists who are participating in the pathology because they're so ignorant about psychology. So we actually need quality people over here. So but how am I going to do that? I'm going to set up the frame, capture the transference, and then interpret it back to the psychologists and kind of show them what's going on. And so here's the frame. And so this is kind of the payoff point of everything. Here's the frame I set up, which is the DSM-5 and ICD-11 diagnostic systems. DSM-5 is kind of more anchored in the United States, and that's the one I'll be driving in my conversations with United States psychologists. ICD-11 is for the international scope psychologists. Both of those are established diagnostic systems. They line up with each other. And that's the frame. Apply the established diagnostic systems. And when you do that, you're going to run into a shared delusion and you're going to run into the factitious disorder imposed on another. And it's like, why isn't that factitious disorder? The factitious attachment. You're telling me that's an authentic attachment pathology, and all of a sudden they'll begin to see once you apply the frame of the established diagnostic systems, you'll see what the pathology is, and you'll go, and it'll pop you off of that transference of your protective other role. It's a false factitious attachment. It's not an authentic attachment pathology caused by child abuse. It's false. And it's a shared delusion. It's a persecutory delusion. The moment you start to look, you go, oh my goodness, there it is. And that's child psychological abuse. And you can say, why isn't this? It's not gatekeeping or something like, it's child psychological abuse. Why isn't that psychological child abuse to create this pathology? And it's spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. And that's the key hidden pathology here that drives everything. This is spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. Okay. So then once you put that on the frame, the four diagnoses: delusional thought disorder, factitious disorder, child psychological abuse, spousal psychological abuse. That's the frame. And once you apply that frame to the symptoms and the situation, then you're going to have to explain, why isn't it spousal abuse of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon? Well, it is. Okay, everything matches up. It is. And boom, all of a sudden that'll break the awareness of the psychologists off of their own countertransference of, I'm the protective other, and this is that victimized child, abusive parent, protective parent. Oh, wait a minute. This is not that situation. This is a dream. It's a fantasy. It's a transference of trauma from the pattern. And so that's what I'm doing. The therapeutic frame for the psychologist, the forensic psychologist, is the ICD-10 and DSM-5 diagnostic systems. So you can see that. And now that we've reached this point where I've done everything, you can see that. That's what I'll be applying. I'm applying it very forcefully in my reviews. Come on, you need to apply the established knowledge. That's standard 2.04 of the APA Ethics Code, and that's just basic fundamental practice as doctors, is to apply the DSM diagnostic systems. So then the other feature about applying that frame is it's going to pop out the pathogens process of all these euphemisms that it hides behind. Parental alienation is a euphemism of a made-up pathology label that the pathology is using it to hide behind. The pathology created that label. And that's a whole nother talk. I'll do another talk on that. A pathology is creating this euphemism to hide underneath, and it's using these PAS expert people as its instruments. It's captivating them on their narcissism countertransference and using them as an instrument to hide behind parental alienation. And so I see that. You guys don't see that. But now it's finally run its course with parental alienation. That's not getting any more traction. Cadence law coming through. So now it's switching. You can watch the pathology switch in the forensic people in their minds to now resist, refuse dynamic. And there's no such thing. That's your parental alienation du jour. Parent-child contact problems. No such thing. The pathology is seeking its new made-up pathology proposal. Wow. Now, as a clinical psychologist, I'm watching this take place in the minds, in the infected minds of the forensic people. I'm watching the pathology work to develop its new pathology label to hide under as a euphemism. Well, I'm just going to capture all three of them on the ICD-11, DSM-5. Okay. Don't give me new pathology diagnostic labels. Use the real stuff, okay? If you want to give me fake stuff, do it afterwards, but you got to apply the frame. DSM-5, ICD-11. The moment you do that, it's a shared delusion, factitious disorder. We don't need any of this stuff. It's not a unique pathology in the family courts that we need a unique label for. It exists everywhere. Okay, if there's a pathology in the family courts, it's in society. It's narcissistic, borderline, dark personality, collapsing into persecutory delusion, and factitious disorder, the transference. So you're ignorant, lack of knowledge and information. That's another piece of the frame. If I have to explain the pathology to the doctor, they're not competent by demonstrated need to have the pathology explained, and that's going to be the encounter. But let me wait on the encounter for a second. So there's the frame, okay, the psychoanalytic frame. Now, the second feature of the frame is if we move over to other depth psychology, Jung. So there's Freud and Jung. I like them both. I think Freud goes better into self-psychology, but Jung was an interesting guy, and the archetypes are very solid constructs. And the archetype that we have in this situation is the mirror. You know, that magic mirror on the wall from Disney and stuff, mirror, mirror. And what that archetype is reflection, to catch up reflection, and it's to develop self-reflective insight. That's it. So you show a reflection to develop self-reflective insight. Well, if you go back to that whole discussion of the frame and to capture the transference, that's what it is. The psychologist, me, serves as a mirror to the patient to allow them to see who they are. Okay, now we can do that with analysis. We can do that humanistic existential. We can do that with cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral techniques. Whatever approach we're using, we're basically helping the patient or the client see themselves and to make the changes in themselves, because we're not doing anything. We're just talking to people. So but that's the mirror. Okay, and we're kind of trained in that reflective listening, empathy. We're the mirror to the patient. Well, in this situation, I am that mirror. Okay, and I will be showing professional psychology themselves using this frame, and the mirror is going to be on standard 2.04, standard 2.01, and standard 9.01 in application, duty to protect obligations. Okay, those are the framing for the psychologist that develop self-reflective insight. Do you know what you're doing? Are you competent in what you're doing? And I put in the word ignorance. You Google ignorance, that's lack of knowledge or information. Okay, so do you have the necessary knowledge and information needed for competence relative to the AP Ethics Code? And if you see what's happening here, what I'm doing, I'm grounding in reality on the frame of the DSM-5 ICD-11 to capture the fantasies of the pathology, the transference of the trauma, of these euphemisms and of their participation and belief in the trauma narrative because of their own needs. So, and the mirror is everywhere. So the mirror is just moving through our society right now because that's the archetype that's developing. Self-reflective insight. The next one, we need that insight to do the transformation that's coming. So, excuse me. So now let's talk about the encounter. So I've set the frame. I've done everything. Look back at my work. I've done everything to establish the frame and got it in place. I am the representative of that frame. I'm going to be moving it forward to capture the transference of the forensic psychologist. See, I'm focused on the psychology people to detach them from the pathology. I'm not necessarily focused directly on the pathology. One step removed, getting the psychologists in here for you to help treat the pathology. The third piece is going to be the encounter, and that's what I'm hitting right now, because my reports are going into the court, and my reports are going to be a direct analysis of the pathology in the forensic psychologist. So they're going to be seeing themselves reflected in Dr. Childress and the frame of the DSM-5, ICD-11, attachment family systems. So that is going to produce an interesting situation. It's going to produce resistance, first off. So all the top psychologists, forensic custody evaluators, will not want to recognize the pathology, recognize the situation, nope, 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 nope. And I call that the Escher paradox, that the shared delusion cannot neurologically see itself. And so you'll see that in the general surround with this whole shared delusion that we got going in our society, is if you try to help them into awareness about this is lies, this is a delusional thing, it just bounces off. It won't, they cannot process that information because this pathology, this shared delusion trauma pathology that we're talking about, needs that delusion to self-regulate. It needs that other reality to organize itself straight. Otherwise, it collapses. So when you get in there and challenge the reality, it becomes very rigid. And so that's one of its hiding things. If you're not going to challenge it, then it can hide underneath and act like it's normal. It's just a political belief. I just believe in small government and stuff, and it's hiding. But if you challenge the delusion, you get the locked in rigidity of the child is being abused, the child is being abused, kind of thing. And so that's a response to intervention, basically, is you just pop it when you want to pop it. You set the frame, you catch it, and then you pop, and you pop it out with changing context. So that's technical on how to assess for it. With the final feature here, though, with the encounter, we're going to enter a phase, and this is kind of interesting. So you can be watching for it. You're going to be entering a phase where here's the frame going into the encounter. A patient should never have to explain the pathology to the doctor. Okay, the doctor should already know and should be explaining it to the patient. There's your ignorance part of the frame. And so, and the ignorance, using the ignorance word, is going to trigger a narcissistic injury. Okay, so it's captured on their narcissism. I'm special and my opinions are great. So I'm triggering a narcissistic injury by calling it ignorant. And so I'm activating their pathology. Now, they got an active pathology now by calling them ignorant. But the patient shouldn't have to explain the pathology to you. And I'm pulling the DSM-5 and saying, it's real stuff. It's not your made up stuff. So now they have to explain the pathology using real stuff, but they don't know the real stuff. So they're going to have to become educated in the real stuff, which is the narcissistic injury. And my interpretation is if your patient has to explain the pathology to you, you're not competent by demonstrated need to have the pathology explained to you by your patients. Okay, that's just baseline. Now, if Dr. Childress has to explain the pathology to you, you're not competent by demonstrated need to have Dr. Childress explain the pathology to you. So if anybody is explaining the pathology, you're not competent. And guess what? If you're using parental alienation, resist, refuse, parent-child contact problems, or your made-up pathologies, you're not having the pathology. You're not explaining it using real terms. And I'm going to hold you standard of professional practice. Doctors use real stuff, okay, to communicate to each other. And so you're not practicing at a doctor level yet by explaining the pathology using the DSM-5, ICD-11. Okay, so boom. So that's the encounter process. Now, there will be a portion. We're going to find out how large a portion, very interesting for me as a clinical psychologist. There will be a portion of the psychologists in the family courts who will be unable to process that information. Okay. They will refuse to apply the DSM-5 and ICD-11, just like the PAS experts, self-proclaimed experts, refuse to apply the DSM-5. Because the moment they do, boop, the pathology pops out. It's no longer hidden. Everybody sees it, and it stops. So the participants in the pathology, the allies who are disabling the mental health system, when given that DSM-5, won't do it. Will not do it. And it'll be the Escher paradox. I was doing some consultation with a psychologist, Dr. Elise, in Australia. And what we're talking about this issue with the mental health people. And my recommendation or insight that I provided to her is we're reaching a phase where it's going to be very interesting encountering the other psychologists. Because when you present them with this DSM-5, ICD-11 information, you'll see that their eyes glaze over and they just don't encounter it. They don't process the information. And when you see that, that's a mild dissociative state. You've just induced a mild dissociative state in this psychotic disorder by confronting the delusion with reality. Okay, the reality is DSM-5, shared delusional disorder, factitious disorder, child abuse, and spousal abuse using a kid as a weapon. There's reality. And they're unable to process that information, so they just move away. Now, there will be another set of psychologists who will encounter that information, and it'll break them out of the transference, and they'll get the interpretation and go, oh, I see what's going on. And they'll get that meta perspective of a real psychologist who's not in the middle of the pathology and becoming part of the pathology. No, you pop out, you're a psychologist, come on, see what's going on. And once you see what's going on, then it's so easy to treat. This is actually really easy to treat. Diagnosis guides treatment. We need the child abuse diagnosis. As soon as we get the child abuse diagnosis, it's really easy to treat. The attachment pathology is simple to fix. Okay, so that's not a problem. It's just we have to protect the child. We cannot ask that child to reveal their authenticity until we can protect the child. Okay, so but that's a talk for a different time. That's the betrayer role in transference trauma. Interesting role. So with that, I'm going to run off to the rest of my work day and things. So off goes a little chapterette or a little dialogue piece on the transference in the family courts, the countertransference of the psychologists who are being captivated into the false trauma reenactment narrative, the psychoanalytic frame that's going to pop out the transference of the forensic psychologists against the frame of the ICD-11 DSM-5 diagnostic systems. And then a little bit of the analytic process of triggering their narcissistic injury that'll activate the pathology. So, got that glowing. Then I put up against the frame of the ICD-11 DSM-5 diagnostic system, and then that will either pop the psychologist out of the pathology so they get a meta perspective and looking down and return to being actual doctors rather than this quasi-judicial role that the pathology created. The pathology created the forensic psychologist. It did. That's a really weird, different talk, but that's really interesting. And so, it'll either pop them out or they'll stay confused. And it'll be obvious that they're just trying to disable the mental health system, that they're not applying the DSM-5. They're refusing to apply the DSM-5. And they'll run away, is my anticipation. But we're going to find out. That's so interesting for a psychologist. We're going to find out what happens when you intervene on the pathology. And so that's internet psychology. It's going to be very interesting, the intervention on the forensic psychologists, their delusional disorder and their countertransference. So good luck, everybody, and we'll just check in about some other aspect the pathology some other time. Bye-bye.